Hi again. I'm happy to see that my last video has been received well. It definitely boosts my motivation to make more videos. Anyway, last time we addressed the basics of EQ for dialogue, but this usually isn't enough to reach a professional sound quality. Today I'll be talking about compression and dynamics processing for dialogue. I'll address some basic theory that's necessary to understand before you can use compression. I'll show you some of my favorite ways to use compression. I'll also briefly mention some quick thoughts on other types of dynamics processing, like de-essing. And I'll once again show you some high-quality plugins. Before we get to any of that, though, it may be worth discussing why compression is important. In fact, I think it's the most important part of processing dialogue recordings. We've been talking about compression up until now, but what we're really discussing is part of the dynamics domain. Compressors, limiters, gates, dynamic EQs, de-essers, and many more types of effects fall under the dynamics domain, and they all employ compression in one way or another. All of these effects contribute to one of the key pillars of professional sounding audio: consistency. Using an expander gate keeps your noise floor low during moments of silence in between speech. Compression helps with keeping you intelligible, regardless of speaking volume, as well as helping you stay audible over any sounds or music. De-essers keep your S's and T's from piercing ears, and limiters make sure you never get too loud. Keeping your dynamics under control is one of the best ways to keep people from complaining about your sound quality. Don't worry, I'll certainly cover the others in the future. Moving on, I'll now start talking about the mechanics of a standard compressor. I think that if you understand these, you'll be able to understand nearly all dynamics processing effects, and the simple compressor is likely the best way to illustrate these mechanics. Let's start by talking about ratios and thresholds. Two controls found in some form on any compressor worth its salt. In the simplest terms, whenever a compressor receives a signal that's loud enough to pass the threshold, it divides the sound above the threshold by the ratio. So say that we have a ratio of 2:1, and the signal passes our threshold. However much it passes the threshold by will become half as loud as it was before going into the compressor. So, I've told you about the ratio and threshold controls, and I think it's time I show you visually. For this, I'll use my go-to compressor, Pro C2 from FabFilter, as I think it has a pretty clear interface. On the left here, you can see the knee. This is the curve that visually represents your compressor settings. The knee bends at the threshold, and its angle is determined by your ratio. As you can see, when the ratio is 1:1, the knee doesn't bend at all. But at 2:1, it's a 45-degree angle, showing you that everything that passes the threshold will be halved in volume. At a certain point, the ratio is so high that the knee reaches a nearly 90-degree angle. Some compressors may even allow this. At this point, you've made a limiter, and practically no sound will be able to get louder than your threshold. Until now, I've purposefully omitted the attack and release controls from my explanations. These are simple to understand in theory, but are the controls people struggle with the most, as their effects are difficult to hear and build a feeling for in practice. It's also worth mentioning that many analog compressors simply didn't have controls for attack and release, and they were simply limited to their inbuilt settings. A good example is the Teletronics LA2A. Let's start with attack then. The attack control governs how fast the compressor pushes down the signal that passes the threshold. Set it to be slow, and the first part of a loud sound or quick punchy sounds will stay unaffected by the compressor. Set it to be quick and fast, and everything will get caught. I personally find that faster attack times work well for dialogue. Leaving the start of a volume increase unaffected will trick the listener's brain into perceiving loudness, without me having to actually blow out their eardrums. Don't set it too fast though. You'll notice that your recording may start sounding weird and pumpy. I'll elaborate further on this when I explain my steps for setting up a compressor later. If attack governs the speed of the compressor kicking in, release is the same for the compressor letting go. Setting the release slower may affect part of the signal that wouldn't have passed the threshold, and will give a smoother and glue-like effect. The previously mentioned LA2A has a slower release time, and this has made it a good choice for dialogue. Lastly, I want to talk about makeup gain. Typically, the compressor reduces the dynamic range of a recording as a whole, and this lowers the overall volume too. To make up for this, you can use makeup gain. Most compressors give a numeric readout of the amount of gain reduction they've applied. I tend to just add it back in makeup gain. Some compressors can do this automatically. Don't think on this control too hard, it's the simplest out of all of them. Now then, let's take the recording I EQ'd in the last video and apply some compression onto it. First, I'll decide on my ratio. I'm reading a paragraph from A Study in Scarlet, part of the Sherlock Holmes series of books by Arthur Conan Doyle. That is to say, I'm basically recording an audiobook. I want my compression to be nice and subtle, just to keep the volume of my delivery consistent. I think a ratio of 2:1 is good, but I may go up to somewhere between that and 3:1 if I'm especially dynamic in my delivery. This was a lofty chamber, lined and littered with countless bottles. Broad, low tables were scattered about, which bristled with retorts, test tubes, and little Bunsen lamps with their blue flames flickering. This doesn't have an audible effect yet, since I've not set my threshold. Let's do that now. Using your ears is important here. Setting the threshold to be too aggressive will make your recording sound aggressive in turn. A good rule of thumb to aim for is to stay between 2 to 4 decibels of gain reduction for dialogue. You may want to go higher if you have to mix your recording in with loud or busy music. For now though, let's turn the threshold until I hit roughly 2-ish decibels of gain reduction. This was a lofty chamber, lined and littered with countless bottles. Broad, low tables were scattered about, which bristled with retorts, test tubes, and little Bunsen lamps with their blue flames flickering. There was only one student in the room, who was bending over a distant table, absorbed in his work. At the sound of our steps he glanced round, and sprang to his feet with a cry of pleasure. This was a lofty chamber, lined and littered with countless bottles. Broad, low tables were scattered about, which bristled with retorts, test tubes, and little Bunsen lamps with their blue flames flickering. Lastly, let's up my attack and release so the compression sounds more natural and less apparent. The famous LA2A that I keep mentioning has an attack of roughly 10 milliseconds, and the release between 200 and 300 milliseconds. Let's start there and fine-tune. This was a lofty chamber, lined and littered with countless bottles. Broad, low tables were scattered about, which bristled with retorts, test tubes, and little Bunsen lamps with their blue flames flickering. There was only one student in the room, who was bending over a distant table, absorbed in his work. At the sound of our steps he glanced round, and sprang to his feet with a cry of pleasure. This was a lofty chamber, lined and littered with countless bottles. Broad, low tables. Don't forget to set your makeup gain, and with that we've applied some tasteful compression to this sample. Let's have a listen to before and after. This was a lofty chamber, lined and littered with countless bottles. Broad, low tables were scattered about, which bristled with retorts, test tubes, and little Bunsen lamps with their blue flames flickering. There was only one student in the room, who was bending over a distant table, absorbed in his work. At the sound of our steps he glanced round, and sprang to his feet with a cry of pleasure. This was a lofty chamber, lined and littered with countless bottles. Broad, low tables were scattered about, which bristled with retorts, test tubes, and little Bunsen lamps. The type of compression I've just applied works well for my goal, processing an audiobook. But I recommend going more aggressive with your compression for live streaming, as your voice will be competing with music and sound effects. I promised I'd show you some of my favorite ways to use compression. I've shown you one now, so let's show you another. The way to achieve this effect may differ slightly on your plugin, and it's definitely more advanced, but I'll show you it regardless. I take no credit for this idea. The extremely knowledgeable Dan Worrell can be thanked for this. I highly recommend you watch his videos, even if you're not invested in music. Basically, I'll use some aggressive parallel compression, that is to say, a compressed signal mixed in parallel with the original, to give an upwards compression effect. This helps bring out the texture in voices, as well as bringing up trailing parts of sentences. Don't overdo it though. you'll risk your recording sounding too aggressive once again, and this may be fatiguing to listen to for extended periods of time. This was a lofty chamber, lined and littered with countless bottles. Broad, low tables were scattered about, which bristled with retorts, test tubes, and little Bunsen lamps with their blue flames flickering. There was only one student in the room, who was bending over a distant table, absorbed in his work. At the sound of our steps, he glanced round and sprang to his feet with a cry of pleasure. This was a lofty chamber, lined and littered with countless bottles. Broad, low tables were scattered about, which bristled with retorts, test tubes, and little Bunsen lamps with their blue flames flickering. There was only one student in the room, who was bending over a distant table, absorbed in his work. I think I've spoken about compression enough for now. I'll quickly mention a few thoughts about the other main types of dynamics processing I use routinely, those being an expander gate and DSs. Expanders function nearly identically to compressors, except they apply to everything under your set threshold. I often use this in place of a binary gate, because it sounds more natural. This was a lofty chamber, lined and littered with countless bottles. Broad, low tables were scattered about, which bristled with retorts, test tubes, and little Bunsen lamps with their blue flames flickering. There was only one student in the room, who was bending over a distant table, absorbed in his work. Pro G is my go-to for this, but the guitar amp plugin SoftAmp PSA has a pretty good gate that I've used before I had my FabFilter plugins. The S's are very useful, especially on bright voices and microphones. Using them is extremely simple. The Pro DS from FabFilter is practically magic, but I recommend using the free version of Techivation's TDSer if you don't already own a DSer. It's comparable in quality and very easy to use. I think S's should always be slightly louder than normal speech. That's how they'll naturally sound in real life too. So just turn the knob until S's stop sounding painful or annoying. If you sound like you have a lisp, you've gone too far. This was a lofty chamber, lined and littered with countless bottles. Test tubes, and little Bunsen lamps. Pro C2 is well worth its price. It's extremely versatile, and the inbuilt Pro voiceover preset is honestly perfect for dialogue in my opinion. However, if you can't afford that, here are my recommendations for compressor plugins. Lala by Analog Obsession is a digital emulation of the LA2A that I've mentioned throughout the video. Just like the hardware unit, it doesn't have an attack and release control. Simply turn the gain reduction knob until you hit the desired amount of gain reduction on the meter, and then use the makeup knob to compensate for your loss in volume. It's unbelievable that it's free. FirComp from the ReaPlugs pack is a versatile compressor. It doesn't sound as high quality as C2, but it's extremely flexible and likely more than good enough for anyone. It's also capable of doing the parallel compression trick I showed earlier. The Klanghelm DC-1A is a very characterful compressor, with quite a bit of mojo injected into it. You'll find it sounds cozy and pleasant. Tokyo Dawn Labs' Kotelnikov is a mastering compressor with a very clean sound. Likely I'd reach for this if I didn't own the Pro C2. Once again, I hope I've been helpful. Please leave your questions in the comments, I'll do my best to answer them. I've been Rumin, and thank you for watching.